Suffrage is basically having the right to vote. A suffragist is basically somebody who supports women's right to vote. It could be a man or a woman. And generally, suffragists endorsed methods like petitions and speaking to Parliament, what we would call peaceful methods. Suffragette was a nickname given to women who heckled politicians to begin with, interrupted political meetings, and then that escalated to civil disobedience, destruction of property. They belonged to one group in the British movement called the WSPU. They were called the suffragettes. Occasionally it was used in North America too. Sometimes it was just a label thrown out at women, and it could be actually a rather pejorative label, which meant that these were unwomanly women, suffragettes. Well, life was not easy in the 19th century for women. They had very few legal rights protecting them as individuals, and there was increasingly by the late 19th century an ideology that people call separate spheres. The idea that women's place was really in the home, doing childcare, being a mother. That was their primary role. And men's place was in the public sphere, in the worlds of work and politics. But the reality was this was not the case for many, many women, particularly for working class women and farm women. So women's experience actually differed tremendously according to their class background, whether or not they lived in a rural area, their ethnicity, their religion, language, many, many things.
They took a leadership role within their local communities, and that's been a long history of women in Canada. I think we need to look at how women interpreted what was important to them in their particular regions, and it was different for different women. And then how they found some kind of common ground when they were fighting for the right to vote on a national level. We see across the country women who are very active in a local way. Remember that this is a time where there's no unemployment insurance, there's no old age pension. If you want to go to the doctor, you have to pay for it. Women step up to the plate.
In Nova Scotia, there was Mary Ritchie and her sisters who were important. In New Brunswick, Elle Hathaway. In Ontario, Flora MacDonald Denison, who was a mainstay of the Ontario movement. In the Prairie West, Violet McNaughton, Frances Marion Beynon, who both edited women's pages on farm newspapers. And in BC, there was Helena Gutteridge, who was an advocate of labor as well as women's suffrage. So there's actually a tremendous variety ideologically of different women with different points of view when you think about suffrage across the country. I think that the suffrage movement changed its character over time. When it began in the late 19th century, when it gathered some strength in the late 19th century, it tended to be very determined women, working women, socialist women, some professional women who were campaigning for rights for women. And they tended to put a lot of emphasis on women's autonomy, women's freedom, women's equal rights. As the movement gained steam by the early 20th century, it became dominated more by what's often called social reform suffragists. So they may have also believed in women's rights, but they put a lot of emphasis on the vote as a means to an end, and the end was social reform, including temperance. So it did change the nature of the movement. It expanded it, it gave it more numbers, but it also tended to conservatize it a little bit.
Emily Stowe is a superhero because she accomplished so much, and at a time when there were barriers all around her, she kept knocking them down, and in that way she's this superhero.
She wanted to be a doctor, and the only way she could do that was to go to the US and train in the US because no Canadian medical school would admit women in the 1870s. When she came back to Toronto to practice, she led a campaign with other women to allow women into medical schools in Canada. And her daughter, Dr. Augusta Stowe Gullen, was one of the first women to gain access to medical schools in Canada.
The thing about Emily Stowe is that should be enough, but her activism in terms of the women's suffrage is also on top of that, and having 3 children and a husband who's not well. And all of that in her career and the responsibilities of that, she takes on to create the first women's suffrage, the Women's Literary Society that she creates in 1877, and that becomes the Canadian Suffrage Association, of which she plays a major role.
But Stowe was much more than just a campaigner for professional rights. She was actually quite a radical person who was quite unconventional in trying to explore new ideas all the time. So she was a mixture of many things, quite a radical thinker, someone who also knew how to campaign for legislative change, determined always to move ahead and provide widened opportunities for women.
She's an activist in the suffrage movement. She is giving lectures internationally, nationally. She's fighting in the government on policies, as well as running a suffrage movement, traveling, writing, medical doctor, mother. Like, wow, there's a Canadian superhero for sure.
I know everybody wants to talk about Nellie McClung when they talk about women's suffrage, and she is important, but I think she also became an icon or symbol and was made into a symbol for the women's suffrage movement because in some ways she was a very appealing character. She was a novelist and sold a lot of her novels. She was apparently a great platform speaker, very good at performance, very good at debate, and so attracted a lot of crowds. She also knew how to leave a legacy. She left us an autobiography, so we know a lot more about her than other suffragists, and she maintained her interest in politics after the vote was won for many women in 1918. So she did speaking tours, and she sat in the Alberta legislature for a while. So she was able to leave a legacy of important writings that a lot of people draw on. In fact, the suffrage movement was actually a very decentralized movement across the country, and there were many leaders, not just Nellie McClung. The perfect example is somebody who lived in the same city as Nellie, an Icelandic feminist, Margaret Benedictsson, who was quite radical, very interesting, and published the longest-running suffrage newspaper in Canada, called Friha, or Women. And we know very little about her because she simply had a different life than Nellie. She was more working class. She didn't leave an autobiography. Not many of us read Icelandic, so we're just starting to understand how important some of her writings were. But I think the important thing is to think about the fact that there were many Nellie McClungs across the country who led the struggle in their own way, in their own regions.
So Flora is born in 1867. When we were talking about Emily Stowe, she becomes a physician, comes back to Canada in 1867. Flora's born then, so it's a different time period. But at the same time, women don't have the right to vote yet, so she's able to play a role in something that's still ongoing.
She was a little bit different than other suffragists, I think because she at times was a self-supporting mother. She was born in Belleville, Ontario, and by 15 was out earning her own living. She worked as a teacher, she worked as a seamstress, and then when she came to Toronto, she set up her own tailoring business. So she knew something about wage-earning women and some of the problems they had.
She was angry about the conditions that all women working in the garment industry, and it was a big industry for women, because the factory owners could give them very low pay, and people hired women for that reason, that they could pay them less. And the ideas at that time was that women were secondary wage earners anyways. They had some man that was also supporting them. Of course, that wasn't true. Lots of single women without husbands because they died or were disabled, but women got paid about half what men got paid at the same time. Plus, there were a lot of abuses in the factory. So she is writing about those things because in addition to being a dressmaker, a great dressmaker, she's a journalist.
After she became a suffragist, she was given a column to write in the Toronto World, one of the newspapers of the time. And she used that column to raise questions about the need for democracy, the need for social reform, and also the need for women's rights. So she had a perfect platform as a journalist to talk about feminist issues. But she was also organizationally very important for many years, sustaining the organization in Toronto along with Augustus Stowe-Gullen. She traveled internationally, and in fact, she was the one who had contacts with the British suffragettes to begin with.
So at one point, Flora MacDonald Denison goes to the UK to meet Pankhurst, who's so famous. We don't like to compare these the women and the ways that they did the activism, but what happens is that Denison does get involved with a march where some violent behavior took place, and that is seen in Canada as not something that they wanted to have represent for her as a leader, as a president in the Suffrage Association. So she does get criticized for that, but I do think it's not just that. I do think it's her openness about the issues about working class women, the fact that she is criticizing the wealthy, the fact that she criticizes the lack of support for average Canadians. That's not the language that's part of suffrage. Suffrage has been about getting the vote. Suffrage has been tied to temperance, about creating a safer family, of creating a more moral society, creating equity in terms of that lens, and not seeing a capitalist, wealthy society as being unfair to women and the damage that it causes in their lives.
People often assume that World War I caused women to get the vote because they proved their worth as patriotic citizens. This has really been exaggerated somewhat.
They did prove themselves to be great citizens, but at the same time, that's not what got them the vote. They could have had the vote before the war, and they might have had the vote before the war if the war hadn't happened. So the advocating for their right to vote is one thing. Their involvement with the war is another one.
While we might see the war as hastening suffrage in some provinces, it actually has to be seen as very divisive as well. Most women, the majority, supported the war, and some of those people argued they should put aside their suffrage campaigning for the duration of the war.
But just like all women don't speak in one voice, this was the same thing in terms of their interpretation of the war. So there are a number of women that don't support the war.
They were a minority, and we know less about them because, in fact, we believe many of the articles they might have written for newspapers would have been censored at the time. They were international in their perspective. Some of them attended meetings outside the country to meet with other pacifist suffragists and feminists, and they tended to be quite reviled by the pro-war suffragists, who went so far as to call them traitors. But all in all, it became a rather divisive time for suffragists, and that was exacerbated by the 1917 Wartime Election Act, which the federal government introduced to hurry along its support for conscription.
The wartime elections vote gave women the right to vote. If they're active in the war, they have the right to vote. If they're connected to people that are involved in the war, they get the right to vote.
In general, Quebec was very anti-conscription, and suffragists there were completely dismayed that the vote was tied to whether or not you had a son, father, male relative serving overseas. That is who secured the vote in 1917. And in fact, it became divisive across the country, particularly on the prairies, but elsewhere too, because some suffragists actually stood up and said, no, this is discriminatory. Give the vote to all women. Don't give it just to some women because of their ethnic background. But I think we have to see the war not as a high point, but as a time when the suffrage movement was actually very fragile and quite divided, revealing some of the cracks in the coalition for suffrage.
We live in a participatory democracy that the way in which we engage in that is through voting. But unlike the suffrage movement, which was fighting for the right to vote, we have the right to vote, and yet some people choose not to vote. It's an interesting decision to make. And I do find it interesting that people will say that they decided not to be part of the voting process, when I think the very fact that you don't vote means you were part of the voting process.
We can be very disappointed or disillusioned with the fact that the vote does not deliver as much as we want it to. It does not seem to bring substantive, radical transformation to society. We may be cynical at times about what the vote brings, but I think if anybody took away somebody's right to vote based on gender or race or ethnicity or any other factor, we'd all be in the streets protesting.
In the issues of suffrage, women at that time were very aware of what not having a vote meant. I think we need to think about what that would mean for us as Canadians. But what we can learn from the suffrage movement, what we can learn from the women in the suffrage movement, is their perseverance. I think that's the thing that we can take away the most. So hundreds of petitions over decades of activism to try to get the vote, to try to make change. And eventually it did happen.
I think that suffragists had very high hopes about what the vote could deliver. And they did keep at it in the 1920s and 30s and after, trying to get reforms passed. But they were also somewhat disappointed that the vote really didn't deliver substantial equality that they had hoped for. That may not be a good reason not to vote, but our political rights are not simply about voting either. There's many other ways in which women have organized in society beyond the vote to try and affect social change.
But to persevere and force particular governments to be accountable to citizens because they know that you will not vote for them the next time, and persevering on those issues that you feel are so important that define Canada. And this is an important issue today. Really important for us to make these decisions now about the kind of government we want. The kind of government that we elect will be governed by the people that we vote for. So get out and vote.